Alexander Wolcott, a critic for the New Yorker magazine and part of the famed Algonquin Roundtable, once said, "I'm tired of hearing it said that democracy doesn't work. Of course it doesn't work. We are supposed to work it." That was nearly 100 years ago, but we still hear the same virtual chorus today. Indeed, the one thing that everyone agrees on is that our democracy is not working. Of course it's not. We are supposed to work it. So welcome and thank you for joining us this afternoon for our annual Brown Democracy Medal ceremony, where we celebrate the people and institutions who are doing the work to advance our democracy. I'm Michael Berkman, Professor of Political Science and Director of the McCourtney Institute for Democracy. The story of the McCourtney Institute is one that I think it's fair to call uniquely Penn State. Most of us know about the fierce loyalty of Penn State alumni. Loyalty for our students, for their fellow alumni, and for our Penn State community. I knew some of that before I came here in 1989. But what's amazed me in the 27 years since is the work that our alumni do behind the scenes, constantly pushing us to be better at what we do. Such was the case about 5 years ago, when a small group of our liberal arts alumni recognized, as Wolcott did, that democracy doesn't work unless we work it. They had a vision to bring together Penn State's brightest scholars to work on the issues that democracy faces today. They had a vision of engaging and educating our students so that they can do the work that democracy will require tomorrow. And they had a vision for strategic outreach, ensuring that the impact of our work is felt in communities around the country and the world. And that is how the McCourtney Institute was born. Among these visionary and generous alumni were Tracy McCourtney and her husband Ted, who are here today. Can you please give them a round of applause? We are still young and growing, but in the few short years since our founding, the impact of our work has been felt at Penn State and beyond. Our Mood of the Nation poll has brought together our scholars in political science and big data analytics to produce a poll that goes beyond the horse race of the campaign and produces real insights into the mood of our citizens and the challenges facing our democracy. Our Nevins Fellow program, Nevins Fellows, made possible through the generosity of David Nevins, trains our brightest students in the process of deliberative democracy, and then places them in internships with institutions committed to improving American politics. This past summer, 11 students completed these internships with organizations like the Sustained Dialogue Institute, No Labels, Everyday Democracy, and the Jefferson Center. And of course, we are here today to award the Brown Democracy Medal, a program created by two more generous alumni who I will introduce shortly. The Brown Democracy Medal gives us the chance to recognize individuals and organizations who are thinking innovatively to advance the hard work of building and sustaining democracy. So thank you for indulging me in that brief history of our institute and overview of some of the work we're engaged in today. I hope that you'll visit our website, democracyinstitute.la.psu.edu, to learn more about us and our many public programs throughout the year. Now, to the main event. The Brown Medal recognizes a person or organization whose most recent work is tremendously important, but still flying under the radar. The medal spotlights new ideas and innovations, and thereby gives them the public recognition they deserve, and more importantly, accelerates their positive impact on democracy. Each year, nominees are scrutinized by a distinguished review panel drawn from Penn State faculty, private foundations, government, and the general public. We notify the winner in the spring so they have time to prepare an essay published by Cornell University Press and give this fall lecture to share with students, faculty, local policymakers, and the public. The winners receive an honorarium and a commemorative medal designed in 2014 by Charlie Cunningham, a Penn State doctoral student in arts and architecture. Now, I'd like to introduce Larry and Lynn Brown, two Penn State alumni who have helped us imagine what this institute can be and whose generous support has made it possible. They are passionate advocates for democracy, and their gift to create this medal helps us to shine the spotlight on the best new ideas and practical reforms that can help our country and others govern themselves more effectively and democratically. I'll let Larry tell you about the recipient of the 2016 Brown Democracy Medal. Larry and Lynn, would you please join me at the podium, and please, let's give them a big round.
There's no way Lynn's joining us. She's not as passionate about democracy. Thank you, Michael. Welcome, everybody. Great to see so many friends here. Thank you all for coming. When Lynn and I established the Brown Democracy Medal, we were troubled and concerned with the challenges our country faced: a polarized and paralyzed political system and a disenchanted public. And remember, that was 3 years ago. Hey, maybe we overreacted. It's good where we are right now. But perhaps not. What we hope the medal would do, and what we've seen it do over the past 2 years, is shine a light on the ideas that should give us all hope. Our first medal was awarded to the Participatory Budgeting Project that gave ordinary people a deeper and more meaningful way to engage with their government. Last year, the winner was Joe Tronto, whose book, Caring Democracy, forces people to rethink the obligations we have to one another in democratic societies. And this year, I am thrilled to introduce our third winner of the Brown Democracy Medal, the Electoral Integrity Project, led by Pippa Norris, the McGuire Lecturer in Comparative Politics at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. The Electoral Integrity Project gives scholars and observers the tools to evaluate the integrity of elections around the globe. It helps them identify precisely where a nation is falling short of international standards and what it needs to do to improve its elections. I am not an expert in political science. I know this because for my 4 years at Penn State, every political science professor I had said to me, "Brown, you are no expert." But you don't need to be an expert in political science to know that the integrity of elections is absolutely crucial to any democracy. And so I am delighted that we can celebrate this project today. Please join me in congratulating Pippa Norris and the Electoral Integrity Project.
It's enormous.
I'm not dropping it on her. Okay?
It's beautiful.
I'll put it aside.
Lady Liberty. Thank you so much. So it's a real honour to be here, to meet everybody and to see colleagues. And in particular, I'm very much indebted, and the project is indebted to Larry and Lynn's vision for founding this area. The award is very much for the team. It's not just me. We have a whole team of scholars and researchers based at the University of Sydney and at Harvard, and I'll very much share it with them so that they will also benefit from this. And it's also important because we're just in the process of moving towards the second phase of our project. We've done the first 5 years, we're going to the next. And again, these sorts of external encouragements are something which really gives us impetus to move forward. And of course, I'd also like to thank Michael for the kind introduction to come to the Institute and to see everything that's going on here. And of course, also to Larry and Lynn for the Institute and all the work of all the colleagues which are here and our students as well. So, what I'm going to talk about is some of our work. A lot of it is very international. We cover every country around the world, more or less. We cut out a few which don't have any elections. Today that's only a handful. But when I was thinking about what topic should be the best focus for today's talk and the paper, I really thought that we needed to focus on the current crisis of legitimacy in the United States. All of us, I think, are anxious, are worried, are concerned of every political spectrum about where American democracy is going and what's going to happen in the election. So it seemed like a suitable opportunity to really stand back and to say, what is the quality of American elections? What's their integrity? And how can we think about why elections are flawed in this country, and in parenthesis, how to fix them. So, the first part, what's wrong with them, I think is an easier task than how to fix them. but I'm going to give you a few ideas, if I can, on some of those different issues. And everything's available at the electrointegrityproject.com, so if you'd like to look at the paper, if you'd like to look at any of our publications, our data, or our colleagues, everything else is all there. So, I have my thing, perfect.
Yeah. You're empowered.
So first, I'm going to talk about some of the challenges, and in a sense, there are many, many long-term challenges. I mean, we could be here until next year. But I'm going to focus on 4 which I think have been highlighted in the current campaign. And they're issues which all people are concerned about, are somewhat anxious about, and we'll think about why they've arisen and why they've become increasingly problematic. Then I'm going to talk about how do we know whether these are real problems or whether they're just anecdotes. Whether the claims and allegations are true, we need good evidence. And in particular, for any policy analysis, we need to think about how do we measure the concept of electoral integrity, or free and fair elections, or the quality of elections. And so I'll talk about how we try to do that. And we do that for every country, as I said, from Cuba and Zimbabwe through to France, Sweden, and all the rest. Then I'm going to think about how America compares when we look at the last couple of elections in America, compared with many other countries, both Western democracies and countries worldwide, and then a select number of potential fixes or solutions, or at least general reforms that we might want to consider and talk about and think through. What else could we do? And the emphasis I'm going to put is that we can't simply go for sticking plaster solutions where we just have temporary things, where we have small changes. We need to think about the electoral laws, and we need to come to some sort of bipartisan agreement, which emphasises that when we vote, when we register, it shouldn't be a partisan matter. It shouldn't be a matter where we differ. It should be one which emphasises both security and voting rights and convenience. These aren't trade-off values. We need to combine them all to have electoral integrity. I'm going to emphasise as the second strategy that we need to think about professional electoral management. In the United States, it's very decentralised. The processes whereby we register to vote, whereby the process is administered. In many other countries, there's more of a central commission, there are uniform standards, and that means that there are simpler ways to spread information. And we want to make sure that the staff, the poll workers, and everybody else who's administering elections is up to a good professional standard. Thirdly, we need to expand transparency and monitoring to make sure that the electoral workers are effective, to make sure that there aren't problems at the polls. We need to have citizen activism to observe what's going on in every place around the country, to really say, where are there problems, let's highlight those, and where are there effective elections. And then lastly, and this is in some ways the most challenging worry which I've got, if the election ends up in any sort of accusations, where accusations of fraud or vote rigging are really being bandied about, on one side or the other, it doesn't really matter, and the legitimacy of the election is problematic. At present, we rely upon the Supreme Court, essentially, as we did in Florida. What we need is some effective mediating mechanisms, some dispute resolution mechanisms, so that we can come to that on a routine basis. And if there are problems, sort it out at the local level, at the state level. But really, we need to put those in place, just like many other countries, where we can get over any of the problems which we think exist. So, what are the challenges? What are the problems? And what I'm going to base this on is drawing from 3 books which I've written for Cambridge University Press. The first one was an agenda setter. It was, why does electoral integrity matter? So it was trying in many ways to set a new agenda, to say that the problems of free and fair elections actually are rising up in political science. There are many different areas of comparative politics, of international relations, of issues of civic engagement and political behaviour, of issues of gender politics. All of these are concerned with different dimensions of electoral integrity. If an election has these problems, does it matter? Does it matter, for example, for confidence and trust in political processes, in elected institutions? Does it matter for our faith in democracy? Does it matter for whether we turn out to vote? Does it matter for whether we demonstrate? Does it matter for whether there's violence or whether there's an outcome which is contentious? And the first book was really trying to say, yes, there's good systematic evidence that where we don't trust elections, then many other problems emerge in the body politic. And in some ways that's just common sense, but it needed to be demonstrated so that we actually can understand that this is a serious problem which needs to be addressed in many countries around the world. In some, we can get over those problems quite easily. We can accommodate differences. In others, regimes fall. We have tremendous amounts of electoral violence, particularly in Asia and in Africa. So, electoral integrity matters. The second book was, what's the problem of elections? And so here we're reversing it. We're saying, if the elections are problematic, why is that? Putting forward different explanations from institutions, social structures, international relations, all of which can help to explain why some elections are really quite successful and other ones aren't. And the last book is the one which has been the toughest to actually write. It's the one which I've been working on over summer and finishing, thank goodness. It'll be out next year. And this is really what do we do? And it's what do we do as an international community? We're now spending billions of dollars on trying to promote democracy, but also provide electoral assistance. The first thing after any peace-building process in any country is to hold an election. We've tried it in Iraq, we've tried it in Afghanistan, we've tried it in the DRC in Africa, and many other countries around the world. What do we do to make those elections work, particularly in the most challenging circumstances of countries which are emerging from conflict, of countries which are poor, of countries which don't have a history of having elections? So I think we've been doing this now for about 2 decades. It really expanded in the early 90s. We should now be able to say some of these things are more effective than others. Some of these things are the lessons of what works. And this book in particular, the subtitle of it is also emphasizing it's a pragmatic case for electoral assistance. Because there's a big push right now to say that democracy promotion doesn't work, that we're wasting our money, that we should retreat, we should put America first. Even countries in Europe are retreating somewhat from trying to strengthen democracy. Countries like Norway and Sweden putting some of those resources back into helping things like refugees and problems at home. And I think that we should not retreat too much. We should learn the lessons of what works and really try to expand that and use those lessons to improve what we're doing. Some things are better than others, and we need to speak truth to power, really analyze things effectively and say what might work. So let's then talk about the United States in particular. That's the background to the project. What's the problems? Well, here's a whole range of them. In the long term, and by the way, I'm sure that all of you can add more to this list. In the long term, of course, partisan gerrymandering. Not having judges, not having impartial groups draw the boundaries, but allowing the politicians to draw the boundaries. In America, we take that for granted. But it's actually rather a strange process. In many other places, it's an impartial process, or a judicial process, or a process which is done by a commission, which doesn't have partisan interests. Limited ballot access. Again, we like to think that the laws in America are open, but in fact, if you're a Democrat or a Republican, yes, you can get on the ballot in straightforward ways. If you're a third-party candidate, it's very tough to get all the signatures, to meet all the requirements, to get any sort of campaign that goes across the whole of the country in particular. Issues of commercial news and infotainment. This is the work of colleagues like Tom Patterson at the Schornstein Center, and the ways in which serious news, policy news, news about issues is driven out by commercial news, which is led by celebrities, or by the latest scandal, or whatever the Twitter feed is, which is just read straight out as though somehow this is news, without any journalistic intermediary saying anything about that. Lack of women and representation for minorities, of course, a continuing issue. And in some ways, it's really interesting in 2016 to think that, in particular, Hillary, that she's facing barriers which fell in many, many decades ago in many other countries. When Theresa May became Prime Minister in Britain very recently, there wasn't that much discussion about the fact that she was a woman. Obviously, there'd been Mrs. Thatcher, she was following in her footsteps, or in her stiletto heels, but Theresa May, by the way, always has incredibly exotic shoes, stylistic trademarks, but anyway, she has kitten heels. But in America, it seems that not just does Hillary have problems or challenges, but that there's a backlash against women in office in all sorts of ways, which, again, I find really a concern in this current period, in this country. So all of those are background problems. But what's really challenging in the more recent period is the growing party polarization. Again, many issues about how you register and how you vote should be administrative issues. What are the hours of polling? What are the processes you need to have your vote verified? What are the ways in which you can register? These should be matters which we can all agree upon, which there should be a consensus. Ever since Florida in 2000, however, the parties have been moving further and further apart in general, and as a result, these fairly routine matters have now become a pitched battle. So the Republicans are consistently saying the problem is voter fraud, by which they basically mean voter impersonation, that somehow people are voting more than once, or that people who are not citizens are able to vote. That's what we really mean by fraud in America, and therefore we need stronger security. And when the argument is made that, of course, there should be some sort of voter ID, you have to say, well, if you do present a photo ID for other things, why not voting as well? That seems logical. But of course, the voter ID is not there for many minority groups. And it's also at some cost. It's not that the state itself provides you with a photo ID on free and an equal basis. So that's the concern of the Republicans, and countering that, the Democrats will say the problem is voting rights and inclusiveness and turnout, and making sure that everybody who is entitled to vote is able to vote. Again, simple things like, for example, as one reads in the New York Times today, many Hispanics are now seeking citizenship so that they can vote in this election. They're really anxious. There's long lines to do that. It might be that the delays prevent many Hispanic groups actually becoming citizens and then having time to register to vote. So here, you have to say, surely convenience voting is a common sense reform. Convenience voting are things like extending the hours, extending the days, making it easier so that it's easier for you to cast a vote or to register, for example, online with some verification processes. But even though that, you'd have thought, would have been a common sense solution, it's now an issue which is highly polarized. And the Republicans are saying that's going to allow fraud or insecurity. And the politicians are not saying let's combine the two. Let's make sure we have security and convenience. They're saying it's one or the other, it's a trade-off. The issues of vulnerability to cyber hacking is an issue which has not been on the agenda seriously before, but in this election it is. As we've seen, the break-ins into the DNC records, and now we've found in a couple of areas the voter rolls in local states have been broken into, and the director of the CIA says this is foreign powers, probably Russia, not a 400-pound person sitting on a bed somewhere. But it is very worrying. And again, the director of the CIA says, well, it's not going to change the outcome, because we're so decentralized in this country. Maybe they get access to a small polling area, or maybe they get access to a voting roll or an official count in one precinct, but it won't change the outcome. But frankly, think what even that vulnerability could do to confidence and trust in the electoral process. And again, all of us, some of you haven't lived through Florida, but all of you who have lived through Florida, and I know quite a few of you have, looking around, know how that really damaged and laid lasting damage to our trust in the electoral process. It wasn't just a small event in one county in Florida, it really infected the whole of the American political system in some ways. So if one or two polling districts are found to have some sort of hacker fingerprint, then I think that's really of concern to all of us as well. And you know, we're still using computers running Windows 2000 to have our records for voter registers. I mean, in this day and age, after all, we should have better technology. So cyber hacking is a concern. Deregulation of campaign finances is a concern. And again, at the New York Times today, if you read that, the issues of dark money and fat cats. Fat cats were the phrase we used to use in 1974 for Watergate, where a few large donors would manage to buy their way in, they would contribute unlimited amounts. After 1974, there were limits. Increasingly, deregulation has reduced all of those limits. And again, the New York Times suggests that after both of the major candidates are going to be funded by about 250 people, big donors. So there are problems there about the deregulation of campaign funding, meaning lack of transparency, and the lack of professional standards. A lot of things that go wrong in American elections aren't intentional. They're nothing which is planned, they're not rigging. They're just that somewhere runs out of ballot papers, or somewhere else hasn't managed to actually have a very accurate voter register. And so when they try to take out the older names, they manage to take out the wrong names. Or there are certain local officials who don't open on time, or don't acknowledge certain rights, etc. It's often technical things, it's nothing major. But every time that the election goes wrong, that's a fundamental problem in that district, and again, for our trust in the process. And in many other countries, it's much more professional, particularly in many newer democracies, where they know that they have to get these things right. Because if they don't, there's going to be real conflict, and the country itself has to pull itself back from the brink if they don't have an effective election. And lastly, the erosion of confidence. So there was an August Gallup poll that looked at how average Americans think about elections in this country. They found that half were fairly or very confident that the votes would be counted, that their votes would be counted. 2/3 of Republicans did not have that confidence. And another survey found that half thought that there was a widespread use of voter fraud. So if that's the situation now, with all the discussion going on, fed by the media and high leadership views, imagine if some other of these problems we've talked about actually occur, then I think we're really heading for a major crisis. It's the sort of thing, by the way, which wakes me up at night. Donald Trump wakes up to Twitter feed other people, but I wake up worrying about the quality of American elections right now, along with checking my RCP to see where the polls are saying. So, I see I'm not alone in that as well. So, we've got a patchwork quilt. So, are these claims fundamentally a problem, or is this hyperbole? Is this exaggeration? Well, to try and understand that, we really need to say, what's our systematic evidence? Not just anecdotes from the New York Times or the Washington Post or politicians, but how do we know how the standards of elections run? So what we'll do is, first, this is the Electoral Integrity Project. These are the 3 aims that we started with in 2012. We wanted to know, when do elections meet international standards? It's always contentious, it's always disputed. There's always one side that says the election is fair, the other side says not really. So we need some independent evidence for that. What happens when elections fail? And lastly, what can be done, which is still a work in progress. And it was established with a team at both Harvard and Sydney, one for summer, one for winter. Now, what do we mean by electoral integrity? Well, here we've developed the concept. There are lots of different words for this. We can talk about electoral malpractices, we can talk about maladministration, we can talk about fraud, rigging, etc. So what we emphasize is this. Electoral integrity refers to international commitments and global norms. So it's not about my view about how an election should run. It's not about your view about how an election should run. It's the international standards. In other words, this is based on human rights. And you'll note it does not say the word democracy. It doesn't say the T word in that opening statement. It says instead the conventions, which have been there since 1948, and the International Convention on Human Rights, the treaties, the written agreements, the regional agreements, and other international conventions which give us protocols and guidelines. And these are universal standards. So I don't go around when I'm visiting other countries and say, you've got to do what we do. And I certainly don't say, Harvard knows what we should be doing, which wouldn't get us very far. Well, I'm sorry, it moved on its own. Come back. There you go. Instead, I can speak to people in Vietnam, I can speak to people in Cuba, I can speak to people in Russia, and I can say it's the international community standards that we should all be meeting. And we're all flawed, we're all failing, we're all having problems, and we need to learn from each other about the best practices to achieve these standards. And it happens that this means that we're talking about the electoral cycle throughout, so we're not just talking about what happens in polling day, nor are we talking about what's happening during the campaign. It's right the way through, from soup to nuts, from the electoral law, through the campaign, media and money, through the actual election process, to the announcement of the results and so on. So it's a cyclical process, and the opposite are electoral malpractices. So we break it down into these 11 different stages of the electoral cycle. And the interesting thing is that different countries have problems at different stages. So some countries, for example, have electoral laws which are so gerrymandered, I'm thinking of countries like Singapore or Malaysia, that the opposition just can't win. The seats are drawn in such a way that you're going to get the governing party coming back year after year, ever since founding, basically, 1957. In other countries, it can be problems of voter registration, who gets onto the ballot. In other countries, by the way, who is even counted as a voter, who's a citizen in many countries, can be a real problem. And then it's questions of how do you become a candidate? Think about Iran and the ways in which the candidates are vetted. So you can try to stand, but the supreme leader will determine which of those are actually going to run. Or it can be problems of campaign media. Is there a balance? Are there outlets for everybody? Is everybody getting information? Or campaign finance. And again, is there a level playing field? Very much what Steve Levitsky emphasizes in Latin America. How are people able to vote? How are people able to the vote count, the results, and the electoral management body? So there's no one single solution or one single weakness in different countries. There's different weaknesses, and the idea is to diagnose where those problems are. So what's the evidence that we gather? Well, what we do is we use expert evaluations. Expert evaluations are being used all the time now in the social sciences. Think about how do we measure corruption? 20 years ago we said we couldn't measure it, and then Transparency International came along with a corruption perception index based on an expert survey, and now we use that all the time to compare countries. Similarly, the largest new data set we now have, VDEM, is based on experts. So what we do is an expert survey which aims to cover all parliamentary and presidential elections since we started. We don't aim to go backwards. We don't think that we can construct levels of electoral fraud in 1900. VDEM does. Good for them. I'm a little sceptical, but we don't think you can do that. But what you can do is you can basically use experts. We have 9,000 experts. We're currently covering 213 elections, 153 countries, and we go to the expert 1 month after the polls, and then we ask them a series of questions about their perceptions of electoral integrity. And we release the data, and we're also, by the way, doing some comparative within countries, like in Mexico and in Russia, we have sub-national teams. All of our data is immediately released because it's amazingly useful for graduate students and for many others who want to be able to actually examine their own country or their region or see how the election works in practice. And this is really important also, of course, for many countries where the opposition is claiming there's problems, but they have no evidence. And so we find around the world the amount of attention in many places like Malaysia has been enormous, where they've said, look, a new study, a solid social science study by Harvard and Sydney shows that we're doing pretty badly in our overall rankings, we should be doing much better as a country. So it really is a way of also raising the flag and providing information and ammunition for those who want to reform the system. Independent evidence from perceptions of what's going on. Now, election experts are always a question, so I'll just show you this very briefly. Who's an expert? Well, we're all an expert, right? We all like to think we're an expert. So what we do is we pick social scientists, political scientists, who have demonstrated knowledge through things like membership of a professional association or publication or university employment. We pick 40 experts per country, and we get a mean response rate of 30%. And we do try to mix up international and domestic observers because they might theoretically have different views. Your views about how the American election goes might be very different to somebody in Canada, somebody in Britain, or whatever. These are the sort of questions we ask. And they're meant to be, they're all 5-point scale. And so ask yourself, after November the 8th, if you were to fill out the questionnaire, the question is, do you agree or disagree electoral laws were unfair to smaller parties in the last American election? Elections were well managed. Some citizens were not listed on the register, etc., etc. We have 50 questions that we ask our experts, and they're not technical. We're not asking them about the law, we're asking about the practice in their country as they see it. So, like any expert judgments, we're using it as a proxy because we don't have direct evidence in most of these countries about these sorts of issues. And this just shows you our countries. It's basically the larger countries, excluding the microstates, mainly because we can't find our experts in Nauru and Palau and a number of other little smaller states. But basically, we're trying to cover the world out of all the states. So, let's look at some of the results. Firstly, some of you have seen the paper, I know. Some of you haven't seen the paper, right?
No.
You've all seen the paper?
No, many people haven't.
Many people haven't seen the paper. If I was to ask you on a 100-point scale, we put all these items together, and we try then have a 100-point. Oh, it's just I wish I would move. This seems to move on its own. But anyway, okay, so it's giving you the answer. This shows you. This is my rabbit hat. The rabbit just kind of jumped out the hat before I even got it. The simple headline that we've repeated now a couple of times is that the United States elections, and these are based on 2014 and 2012 elections, are the worst of all Western democracies. And again, it's not my view, it's the experts' view. And we've had all these other countries which do pretty badly are quite interesting. The United Kingdom is right next door. I thought they might do a bit better. Italy, Japan, and Spain. Australia doesn't do very well either. And we can see we go up, and of course what's at the top? Well, of course, the Scandinavians, because the Scandinavians do well on everything. I mean, it doesn't matter what I'm measuring, it's gender equality, lack of corruption, transparency, and it's Denmark, Finland, Norway, Ireland, Iceland, and Sweden are my top 5, just amongst the Western democracies. So we might want to start thinking, what do they have in common? Why might it be that some of the countries, the Anglo-Americans, seem to be doing not that well, versus the northern Scandinavians, smaller welfare states? But again, we can see there's variation going across. Canada's kind of in the middle, even though they go through electoral reform, etc., etc. Let's look at this a little bit more broadly. So America's not good amongst Western democracies. That's the overall 100-point scale. What about if we expand it further? So here's my map. So what I'd like you to do is look at this and just say, is this what you would have thought would have been the results before I talk to you about the measure? So we've got the green, the dark green obviously is very high, it's a traffic light map. The dark red is the worst, and then we have bits in between. We have some countries like Russia who have just had their elections, so they're going to come in to the next wave when we release it. That'll be wave 5. France has also not yet happened, and some other countries haven't yet had an election. But by and large, we're gradually, and of course China we don't include because we don't have national elections, but broadly we're trying to do that. Any countries there that jump out where you think that's a bit odd? I wouldn't have expected that. Or any countries which you think, oh, yeah, that's not quite right. Please.
Well, a lot of the Latin American countries, I guess, are doing as well as the United States.
They are.
Brazil just hugely.
That's right, absolutely. As you can see, Latin America and the United States are actually in much the same category. Now again, I have many, many colleagues from Latin America with the Electoral Commission and the tribunals which have been set up. Many of the elections have been pretty effective. Certainly, democracy is now well established. There are still some fundamental flaws. For example, in Mexico, there's a problem of criminal gangs and criminality and drug cartels. Andre Schindler is very good on that, so that brings down their total quite a lot. There are problems of vote buying in Guatemala and high levels of corruption as well, so that's also a flaw. We can also see a distinction between some of the Central American and then some of the other Latin American countries. And there's also a difference between the Caribbean and Latin America and so on. But broadly speaking, Latin America is not doing too badly. So if you just take, basically, they're mostly on the high but not very high, along with the United States. So it's not simply a matter of development. It's not simply that the richer you are, the better your elections. And that's good and bad. It's good in the sense that it means that you don't need to achieve a high level of development and income to get a good quality election, but it also means that that's not the solution necessarily to getting your elections right. Any other observations that you'd make from these patterns before we delve back into the American data? Any other countries that jump out which you think that's not right? Challenge the results? Yes? Cuba. Absolutely, Cuba. So Cuba is always coming up as a question, and it's a really interesting question. Why does Cuba come out in our graph as really not too bad? Actually, I will show you this, because this shows you the whole thing quite nicely. And I'll come over here, if this red thing works, which it doesn't. So you can see you've got, say, America's, yes it does. Costa Rica, of course. Costa Rica is greatest democracy, it always comes out well. Uruguay is Switzerland and Latin America. But if we go down, we can see quite a lot of range. And Cuba is in the middle, not at the bottom. Why? Well, we think it's because there are obvious problems of democracy, in particular a one-party state. It means that there's no competition other than the Communist Party. But there are also challenges amongst candidates. Local candidates are nominated through a primary process, so there are a range of different alternatives. There is no coercion that we know about. There is no vote buying. That's actually stamped out quite well by the Communist Party because they're in control. And therefore the process itself is peaceful, and the process is seen to legitimate the eventual winner in Cuba. So the problems which exist in, say, Haiti. Haiti is a country which, as you know, has been decimated by all sorts of crises and problems in terms of political stability, problems in terms of social stability, problems in terms of disasters. Those sort of problems are the things which, and Venezuela, those are the ones which really give the worst marks throughout Latin America, whereas Cuba, not so bad in our rating. Now, you could say if it doesn't have democracy, then how can we say that electoral integrity is high? But remember, our concept is not based on democracy. Our concept is based on human rights. Is there a universal franchise? Are there women able to stand? Are there regular elections? Is there an orderly process, etc., etc.? So according to our experts, Cuba comes out much better than you would expect on, say, the Freedom House Index on democracy. And they are separate things. Sometimes you have to have good governance to have good elections. Sometimes you have to have some democratic freedoms, but the two things aren't the same concept. They're two separate concepts. And we're always slipping back from one to the other. We think somehow elections must be there for democracy. But of course, remember, elections go back well beyond the democracy. Not only historically, but also think about the Soviet Union. They've always had elections. They were one-party elections, but they've always had elections. Very poorly studied, by the way. Some people who want to work on that area really need to find out what was going on then. But elections aren't, they're essential to liberal democracy, but they're not necessarily coterminous. They're not equivalent to liberal democracy. The things are separate concepts. Trying to get that home has really been difficult in the profession. We just slide from one to the other in ways which are confusing in some ways. But electoral integrity is a different concept. Any other countries that jump out, or any other regions that jump out to you as particularly counterintuitive or not what you would expect, or any results you'd like to challenge?
I'm excited to see some light green at the top of Africa.
Yeah,
and we hope that their neighbors could, pick up things from that.
Well, neighbours is not exactly the right word, because of course Benin is right next to Togo and next to Mali. And Togo is one of the worst autocracies in West Africa. Mali was moving that way and then got collapsed by a coup d'etat and the Tuareg, etc., etc. So there are regional effects, meaning you do learn from your neighbours, particularly as you can see the Scandinavian pattern is really there. But the fact that you can get a really poor country, Benin is one of the lowest per capita incomes in the world. It has incredible poverty. It has tremendous literacy. It's an agricultural production, but really has got very little resources. The fact that they can have an election which, according to our experts, is really very good, is actually encouraging to many developing countries who said it's not an insuperable barrier if you have the constitution, which is appropriate, the right institutions, the political will. And now Benin, of course, has gone through from government and opposition on a regular basis since the new constitution of 1990. They really are a success story in political rights, and they're very proud of their democracy as well, even though they're one of the poorest countries. But you'll also know, what's the other pattern in Africa that you'll see from that last continent? That is, as you can see, by and large, is the worst cases. So even though we keep on trying to provide electoral assistance to many of these countries, in practice, so many problems are there throughout the region. And we're always trying to have elections in post-conflict countries. We call them post-conflict countries, but they're not actually post-conflict, they're just conflict countries.
Why isn't Saudi Arabia or any of the Emirates rated?
Because Saudi doesn't have elections. It only has municipal. So when Qatar, UAE, and Saudi have national elections, direct elections, popular elections, not indirect elections, then we'll include them. That would be great. Every time I go to Qatar, they tell me they're going to have elections and then they get postponed. And of course, with the Arab Spring, they've just got further back because they're so worried about what's happening in their region. But other than that, we do try and find every country which has an election, national, parliamentary or presidential, we'll put it in beyond a certain time. So the lessons, if you're starting to think about explanations, is that simply being rich doesn't necessarily help, and simply being in a region doesn't necessarily help. But there are complex patterns which are going on here. I won't go into the explanations for this in detail because we're going to focus on America and the United States, but let's just say that basically there are issues about each of those. And the fact that the United States is in the middle of the Americas and in the middle of, at the bottom of the democracies is something that we really need to explore a little further. So what's going on? Why does America have such a bad rating? So here what we can do is we can break it down. You know I said there are 11 different steps. So what we can do is we can look And each of those ratings, each of these is on a 100-point scale, where we've asked people about the quality of campaign finance, media coverage, voter registration, etc., etc. And you can immediately see what comes out, according to our experts, as relatively poor problems, which really need to be addressed. District boundaries. You know, I started talking about partisan districts and the way that we're allowing politicians to draw the boundaries by and large. There are some states and some localities which are moving towards impartial boundary processes, but by and large they're highly partisan. And that emerges as a major problem because, of course, over the years, the way that the districts have protected incumbents has increased that to mean that many representatives are not competitive. Secondly, what's the other problem? Well, you can see for yourself voter registration, because of the laws which are being passed. We've had over 30 states in the last period which have passed new laws to try and change and improve, bring in new measures of security or new measures of convenience voting. But when those are changed and then they're contended in the courts, immediately that creates all sorts of confusion and conflict. So that's been a problem as well. And we can see campaign finance is the third issue which comes out as tremendously problematic, along with electoral laws. Those two are the other issues there. So again, the lack of deregulation, which I mentioned at the beginning, the lack of transparency, the role of dark money, and the role of large donors isn't just a matter which is a concern to the public who have been articulating that, it's also obviously a concern to the experts as well. And look at what actually does quite well. So things like the actual results, the vote count, and voting processes, people say those are pretty good, by and large. So there are weaknesses that we need to address, and that makes us think, what would be the best solutions to each of those key problems? And by the way, the emphasis on money and media is actually common throughout the world. Those are the biggest steps throughout the electoral cycle in most of the countries that we observe. So again, that's an area that needs a lot more work and a lot more understanding about why they're so weak. Does it matter? And this is the last piece of evidence. And quite simply, the answer is it does matter whether our elections in America have integrity or not. This is from the American National Election Study. And in there, in the last election, we put in a nice measure of how voters thought about electoral integrity. For the questions that we asked of the experts, we also asked of the voters. So that creates a nice measure of the public's perceptions of electoral integrity. And on the vertical axis, what I've got is whether or not they said that they voted and reported voting turnout, and you can immediately see the more confidence you've got in the integrity of American elections, the more likely you are to vote. If you don't think that the elections are free and fair, then you're much less likely to vote. Now, it's a lumpy pattern, it's not a linear pattern, but nevertheless, we find that not just in the American National Election Surveys, but in the World Values Survey and in Global Barometer Survey, it's a more or less uniform pattern throughout. If you don't think the elections work, why would you vote? In many ways, it's a perfect explanation for what's going on. And if elections, therefore, lose confidence, if people lose faith in the electoral process, then I think this is going to have some substantial consequences for patterns of participation in America as well. So, what do we do? So, let me just give you a few ideas, and then I'll sit down and we can talk about these issues and have a Q&A and think about what else we can put onto the table. And as I said, it's easier to diagnose the problems than it is to diagnose the solutions. I know what works in some contexts, and I know what programs have been found to be most effective, but the American context is actually a very difficult one to know what could be the most effective reforms, especially in the current climate and in the probable post-election climate that we're going to be heading into after November. So the reform process, essentially there are 4 steps. First, we have to think about the legal regulations, the legal framework. What does that say? Then, once we can get that right, we have to build the capacity of electoral management bodies so that those laws, those regulations can actually be implemented effectively, efficiently, with the right resources, with the right technologies, and with the right training. Then, we need to also monitor that performance, because we can't simply leave the electoral officials to be in charge of this. We also need to know whether it's working. And then lastly, we need to strengthen accountability and oversight, so that there are multiple agencies, so if something goes wrong, We don't just reveal that, which is what monitoring does, but we know how to actually provide some sort of corrections. So how do you fill out each of those? So here's just a few ideas. First, the pragmatic reforms. What we need to do is reframe the debate about the registration and balloting process. It's always being framed as a trade-off. Either we have photo IDs which are secure, which you verify at the ballot box, so we know there's no voter impersonation, even though, by the way, there's almost no evidence of any voter impersonation. It's vanishingly small according to the Brennan Centre. But that's one side of the argument. Or the other side says all of that is going to get rid of voters' rights, particularly minorities, particularly the elderly, particularly the mobile population, particularly students. And instead of seeing it as an either-or, we really have to go back to saying the two things have to go together. I'm not comfortable to go for one or the other. I need to have convenient voting so that it's much easier for you to register and it's much easier for you to cast a ballot. It should be available, in my view, for example, not just at a very limited time, but over an extended period, without having to give any reason or a particular explanation for that. And those conveniences need to be secure. Because all you need, by making it easier, is to have one or two security breaches, and if the trust goes down, then you lose out all those benefits as well. So combine them. Don't think of them as opposites. And again, if we think about many other countries, there are good ways of thinking about that, and of making elections more efficient, and of making the process more secure, so we can learn from that. Secondly, election management. Now, election management is a very unsexy topic. It really is. It's been relegated to the dusty hallways of Public Administration 101, and most people don't want to think about it, and we don't want to spend the money on it in America, to be honest. We spent a lot in 2002 with the Help America Vote Act, and then we stopped. And so everybody, all the states bought up new machines, and then they stopped. So everything is falling apart right now. And really, you know, if they manage to switch them on in the right order, then we'll be pleased. But we really just don't have independent professional standards of electoral management. In many other places, maybe we could have a forum where we bring together some of the commissions around the world, in Canada, in Australia, in the United Kingdom, in France, in Germany, and just share some of the best practices about how we can train people so that they know what the procedures are, so that we have good equipment, which is reliable, which is valid, and which has a built-in shelf life so that we can then rotate it again. After all, we're meant to be the people who make these equipments. I mean, we should think of this as a big incentive. If we can make Google, and we can dominate in many other things, surely we can have an election that works in terms of its technology. And we need to think about professional standards. And again, I won't go into that in detail, but there are good ways to make sure that people are responsible and accountable. It's a principal agent problem, as people like Mike Alvarez have written about, but there are good ways of doing that. And we do that in many other areas of public administration. We do that in many other public services. We don't accept schools that don't work to certain standards, or that we can't measure those standards, or hospitals or other public utilities. So we need to do this on a long-term basis for our electoral management services as well. We need to strengthen transparency primarily by civic society. This is the role of the media, but it's also the role of civic organizations and observer groups. And new technologies like crowdsourcing are really making this a lot easier, where people can report in real time, through their telephones, through their mobiles, through their internet, all the problems which they're experiencing, but then the electoral officials should respond to those problems in those areas. If they find, for example, that the polling area was shut early, or they ran out of ballot papers, or there was some question about who was being asked for a particular voter ID in that area, then there's a responsibility where those problems are being announced to respond in a timely and urgent fashion. You can't wait until 3 weeks after the election. You have to do it at the time, and with new technology, again, many EMBs, many electoral management bodies are managing to do this quite well. And lastly, as I said, what keeps me up is that we've got more and more partisanship, more and more bitterness, more and more of a heated campaign in ways which I think none of us have lived through, even though, of course, it's not unique. I think Victorian 19th century campaigns were equally vigorous, perhaps. Certainly 18th century campaigns in Britain were certainly vigorous. But we need impartial dispute resolution mechanisms. And in particular, just think of this. So we have a tight election. You know, it's neck and neck, it's a few percent in Pennsylvania, or in Florida, or in one of the other states. And one of the candidates, who shall be nameless, says it was rigged. Or they say that there were problems of partisan officials turning away certain citizens or certain groups. Then how do we actually get over this? At present, ultimately we have to go through the courts, which is a very formal process, and which actually brings in the lawyers, which reinforces differences rather than having mediation processes where candidates can come together, voters can come together on appeal, and really talk in a more informal process. We know about mediation to all sorts of other conflict issues, such as divorce, such as property rights. Can we introduce that somewhat to, at least as the first step, improve our mediation in elections? And we have to do this if the election comes out reasonably well. We have to do this immediately so that for the next election, we don't basically go to the Supreme Court. We can't have the Supreme Court deciding the elections in America, especially, of course, if it's 4-4, because there is no decision. So this is not a democracy. This is throwing away democracy. This is throwing away the whole value of elections if we resort to that particular scenario again. And of course, in the Florida situation, Al Gore conceded. He accepted the process. But all you need is a candidate who doesn't concede and doesn't accept it, or followers, even if the candidate says yes, but the followers believe in conspiracies, or they believe that things were unfair, then you're heading for disaster, basically. You're heading for, without effective electoral justice processes and already some sort of mediation processes that we set up, we're ahead of those problems emerging. Things have got worse, and it won't be in Florida. If we have some similar problems in one state, it'll be much worse than that, because now everything's become politicized about these processes. So that's what keeps me up. And that's, I think, a list of things which could be done if we have the will, and if we have some agreement, and if we can come together after the election, ideally, to really restore trust. And the first line of the paper which I wrote for this is that Humpty Dumpty is very difficult to restore trust, it's very easy to destroy trust. So even a small incident in some states, in some areas, could easily reduce further the confidence in American elections. And if you don't agree on some policies in American politics, that's fine. We can disagree on trade. We can disagree on jobs. We can disagree on reproductive rights. We can disagree on lots of policy issues, and that's politics. If we can't agree on elections and the fairness of the outcome, and we delegitimize whoever wins on either side, then we really are in problems. So I'm sorry to sound rather a damn note to my last thing. Maybe it'll all come out right. Somehow I think not. If you want to see anything else, we have further resources. You can get our data if you're interested in data. You can download that. We have published books. We have published reports. We try to get out to outreach to policymakers, to agencies, as well as to academics. And everything else is available through our website. And I really will welcome your thoughts and criticisms and ideas and suggestions as well. Thank you.
So questions, please.
Lawrence Lessig said he was going to run for president based on campaign finance reform, and once he got it, did you advise him on his platform?
No, I would not advise him to run either. I mean, really, the ego of some of my colleagues is quite amazing. That's off the record, of course. I mean, it was a quixotic attempt to get some publicity for his ideas of reform. And his ideas of reform have validity and certainly should be debated, but as a way of doing it, I found it a little bit strange. And I think there might be some better ways to actually get a consensus going and get the ball rolling. We know that those who supported Bernie Sanders wanted to have some sort of change in campaign finance. It was one of their big issues. And we know that Trump in the early days also said that big money was distorting politics, and certainly the way that it produced an open door for lobbying was something that he might try to address. And we know that there's a broader consensus that really, amongst many politicians, we don't think this is the most effective ways to be always raising money, always being dependent upon a few very rich individuals or donors or large corporations. How we get there, though, with a broken FEC is difficult to know. And how we get there with the current setup of Congress is very difficult. So we need a civic society organisational debate. Open secrets is very good, common cause is very good, but we all need to think about what would we want to do to try to reduce the role of money in politics. And many other countries, we've just published a book called Technical Elections, Political Finance and Comparative Perspective. We have Brazil, India, the United States, Canada, Sweden, all sorts of Russia. And most countries are really going towards public funding. And what America is doing is going away from public funding. So in the past, presidential candidates would get a certain proportion of public funding, but it was so small that they don't feel it's actually worthwhile now to do so. In most European countries, the proportion of votes you get, or the proportion of seats in the previous election, entitles you to some share of public funding, which will fund your campaign in exchange for some spending caps. So the two things go hand in hand, and the case of Britain is a case in point. Again, public funding has really been expanded quite a bit, but in return, the major parties can only spend up to about $30 million in the general election campaign. And they accepted that because it also gave them resources to do the other sorts of information campaigning that they needed to do. So some sort of combination, debated in civil society, would seem to be willing to address these issues. But not Lawrence Lessig, I mean.
Question, don't want to be too much of a cynic, but in order to introduce these reforms, you have to have the incentive to do it and the capacity. It seems that those people who have the incentive to introduce reforms don't have the capacity, and those who do have the capacity don't have the incentive to do it.
That's right. So that's another downer. So yes, we can all identify the problems in a way, but how do you actually get the solution? So the FEC, for example, is absolutely toothless. I went there and they asked me what we could do and how we could help them fund some activities and events because they didn't have any resources there. And it just seemed to me like a dog and pony show more than anything. And again, that's totally off the record. But there are, I think, however, okay, so what has produced reforms in the past? So think about 1974, a tremendous shock to the political system. Watergate did produce enough of a public disgust with outrage with what was going on. The way it was framed in particular, that it was associated with the money that was available. Now, of course, some of the things that Nixon did wasn't actually that much framed in terms of the money, but Congress got its act together. And of course, at the time it was somewhat easier, and sweeping reforms were passed before they were then cut back by the courts just a couple of years later. So that's right. If we have a crisis, I mean, the thing that we're thinking about, it might provide enough of a kick to the system that politicians say we just can't go on the way we have. We have to restore confidence somehow. And doing something, passing laws, is an obvious response to these sorts of things. So if we could strengthen, for example, the election administration, that would be something which we've set that body up in 2002, and it does some useful things, I wouldn't dispute it. If you go to the website, it gives you a bit of information, it tells you about your local area, and it tries to get some standards of sharing information across different states, if they want to cooperate and share some of their voting rolls, for example. So it's not unuseful, but it's never really had enough power to intervene and to provide a more uniform federal standard. And I think that's a body which we could strengthen and give a greater mission, if there was the willpower to do that. Whether or not either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, an administration by either of them, would have the willpower, I leave that up to you to judge.
Do you think elections should be nationalized? I mean, it seems like you run into these problems of federalism, these highly decentralized elections, and then political parties are able to control them at the local level.
Right. So in most countries, it is more centralized. It doesn't mean to say that you can't have local variations, of course, and you can't have states. Again, many federal countries, Canada has Elections Canada, which is the main national body, the one-stop shop. India has an enormous electoral commission. I mean, the man is more or less like God when he runs his elections, but he also has federal states, each of which has to do their work. He has almost 1 million people, staff under him, who are ultimately doing the work in all the different areas over a whole month-long campaign. And many other federal states manage to have an electoral commission which has more power than the FEC, which is about money, it's not really about electoral administration, or the Federal Electoral Systems Body.
Right.
Please.
I was very disappointed to see the poor performance of the United Kingdom, and
Yeah.
I'm sure you were.
Absolutely. I thought they'd do better.
And I did too, because at least they have some control over spending, and thank God they limit the duration of the campaign to a few months as opposed to a year and a half.
Yes, or even 1 month officially.
But what happened there?
So it was partly, now there is an interesting story here. Part of it was that they did try to make things more convenient, and they made it so convenient that of course there were some problems of electoral fraud. So you could register by going online and putting in your name, and more or less that was it, your constituency. And it was really easy. I did it here to register in Edinburgh, which is the last place I lived in Britain, and nobody asked for any sort of ID. Now naturally these registration papers were also found to be in clumps in various areas where people were wanting to register their community in good ways, but nevertheless they were being abused and so on. So those were widely publicised, and they really realised that they had to tidy up some of these details to know how to implement it, to combine convenience and security. And then there were some other issues which are also problematic. Many of the countries at the bottom here have first past the post majoritarian electoral systems. And that means that essentially they're much more likely to just get a few parties in, as Matt will tell us, rather than more proportional. All the ones which are at the top, by and large, all the Scandinavian ones have proportional representation, meaning that small parties can stand, women can stand quite easily, and there are other certain things. For example, there's a higher turnout, fewer wasted votes. So the actual electoral law, the basic electoral system, is very much associated with this. And when a country is thinking about changing its electoral reform, Canada is doing that right now, and they've got a parliamentary commission. Trudeau has said that they're not going to go ahead with first past the post in the next election, but they don't know what system they're going to adopt. So they're working out what they should do and what the trade-offs will be and so on. And all the MPs basically are sitting there in a seminar finding out, all the political scientists are giving evidence about what they should be doing. So the electoral system is part of the story about electoral integrity. If you have lower barriers to smaller parties, if you have a fairer system for smaller contenders, then you tend to get a high level of electoral integrity. And that's systematic. I've got a chapter in the Oxford Handbook of Electoral Systems that basically shows that, lots of controls, etc., etc. So the rules of the game matter for what the UK and why the UK scored pretty badly. And then, of course, its media has its problems as well. If any of you've seen the tabloids in Britain, you'll know what I'm talking about. So there's a problem. Please.
So can it be possible for a democratically elected reader to limit the democracy itself? Because voter ID law was passed by the Republicans and democratically elected readers, but actually that was resulted as putting limitation on American democracy. And what if the majority of American people agree to limit the democracy itself? Can it be justifiable because they went through the democratic process to limit the democracy itself?
Yes. So this is a complex issue about direct democracy and representative democracy. And if the public votes for a particular reform which turns out to reduce civil liberties, or reduce the rights of minorities, or reduce certain fundamental freedoms, but it was a democratic process to do that, then what's the solution? So it's a very good issue for your seminars and democratic theory. Think about the trade-off values of participation and whether people are informed and what the consequences might be. And of course the differences between direct democracy and representative democracy and general democracy. Please, you have a question?
Yes, it may have been captured in your last examples, but of the 4 reforms, is there anything that sticks out as low-hanging fruit where you would start? And if I may just add to that, is there anything that's perhaps sequential in them that one would serve as a catalyst for the other?
So my model says you should do more, because you have to have new laws, then you have to implement them. If you can't do that, then that's useless. And then you have to monitor them, and then you have to have accountability. But in practice, what's the easiest thing to do? Well, it really is the electoral administration. We know how to train people. I mean, amongst other things, the Democracy Institute here and many other institutions can do a tremendous job in bringing in middle-level staff in state office, in local office, and talking about the ways that we can really make the process more user-friendly and more accessible, and yet more secure, and more standardized. And we need to think about the poll workers. I mean, you all know when you go to the poll. It's of a certain age, shall we say. I don't want to be ageist in this group. And they're wonderful civic-minded people, but they're not necessarily the people who can actually implement some of these major changes that we're introducing to the regulations. They don't know what they are. And when, in particular, states change the law, and then we have a court decision which challenges it, and then we go back to something else which has been happening increasingly, then of course there's local confusion. So we need to have good capacity building, and capacity building is very much what we can do. We do that in many other fields of public administration, and I think to make a professional, trained workforce who do elections would be something that's very doable. And every time you hold an election in any other country around the world, especially those which haven't had elections, we're always having capacity building workshops, some of which are more effective than others. But some of the basic issues of standardizing processes, knowing what the laws are, knowing what the regulations are, knowing what you can and cannot ask for when somebody comes to the polls, and processing the vote stages and the vote count stages as well, those things we can do quite well. And we should do them.
Any other questions?
Other questions?
All right. Well, thank you very much.